Okay, so let's dive into Syria today. It's
Yeah.
been in the news for years, obviously. And after decades, Bashar al-Assad is out. So what happens now? I mean, the country's future is a huge question mark, right?
Absolutely.
But, we're going to focus on one really interesting angle. Who's going to control Syria's oil and gas?
Yeah.
And this isn't just like some regional thing. We're talking about the U.S., Russia, Turkey, the EU. All the major players are trying to, get in on the action. It's like a real geopolitical puzzle. And thankfully, we've got an expert speaker here to help us sort it all out.
Well, thanks for having me. What's interesting is that Syria was actually a pretty big oil producer before all the turmoil started back in 2011, pumping out something like 400,000 barrels per day. And it was a very specific type of crude oil, high quality, sulfur rich. And get this, refineries in Italy, Germany, and France were designed to process it.
Wow.
So you can really see how
Right.
deeply intertwined Syria was with the global energy market, even back then.
It's like those European refineries, they were practically built for Syrian oil. That's amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
it really shows you those existing energy ties. It's incredible to think that. All this turmoil basically froze everything, all international operations in Syria for years.
Yeah.
And now with Assad gone, it's like,
Yeah.
someone hit the reset button, everyone's just rushing back in.
Yeah, it's like the starting pistol for a race for control. Speaking of starting pistols, the source material mentions that. The U.S. had plans in place way back in 2011 for a post-Assad Syria.
Really?
They were already thinking about his removal
Wow.
and had ideas about how to manage the situation.
That's interesting.
It really makes you wonder what else they might have up their sleeve.
So they were already planning for the future, huh? What do these U.S. plans look like?
Well, there's a good chance their strategy involves bringing Syria into a Western-controlled energy network. Remember that idea for a gas pipeline from Qatar through Syria onto Turkey and Europe? That might be back on the table.
Right, that pipeline. I remember that. But that's not just about, gas, is it?
Right.
It feels like a huge geopolitical move.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Huge.
Imagine the leverage the West would have over Europe. With all that energy flowing through, it could really weaken Russia's grip on the region, reshape alliances, and of course, it aligns perfectly with the U.S. goal of countering Russian and Iranian influence.
Okay, so the U.S. wants to,
Okay.
pull Syria westward. But what about Russia? I mean, they were Assad's lifeline, right, with their military support and those investments in Syria's energy sector. And don't forget, their military bases, Tartus and Khmeimim, they're projecting power right into the Mediterranean.
Yeah, Russia's definitely playing the long game here. In fact, the source mentions them negotiating with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham.
Yes.
It's a powerful rebel group.
Oh.
With a stronghold in Idlib province, they're trying to secure their energy projects, no matter who ends up in charge. So even with Assad out, Russia's not giving up. They're talking to former enemies to keep their energy plans alive. Wow. But what about Turkey? They're a NATO member, right? But they've been making moves in Syria, too.
Oh, definitely. Turkey has actually offered to take the lead in rebuilding Syria's energy sector.
That's interesting. They're on the same team as the U.S., but they seem to be going their own way here. What do you think is behind their interest? Is it just about getting their hands on more energy?
Well, that's part of it, but there's more to it. Turkey wants to become a major energy hub, especially when it comes to connecting with Europe. And Syria's resources could be a big part of that.
Makes sense.
But it's not just about economics either. They're also worried about the Kurds controlling oil fields in northern Syria.
Right, the Kurds. That adds another layer of complexity. So could this lead to Turkey trying to take those oil fields, maybe even sparking a conflict with Kurdish forces?
It's definitely a possibility. And then there's the question of Ewa, whether the Syrian people will actually benefit at all from this.
Yeah. It feels like everyone's just trying to grab a piece of the pie. It's all about strategy and power plays. And the Syrian people, they seem like an afterthought. I mean, do you think they stand to gain anything from all this competition?
Right.
For their own resources, no less.
Well, that's a good question. And honestly, history isn't really on their side. Yeah, I mean, we've seen this before, haven't we? In countries with a lot of resources, external powers come in, and the local population rarely sees the benefits.
It's a bleak outlook, especially for the Syrian people. They've been through so much already. But let's zoom out for a second. What does this mean for the rest of the world?
Well, for one thing, more instability in the Middle East almost always impacts global energy markets. Remember, Europe relied pretty heavily on Syrian oil. before the conflict. And they're already facing energy challenges. This could make things even tougher.
So this isn't just a regional issue then. It could have global economic consequences.
Exactly. Any disruption to oil or gas supplies from that region can cause price spikes
Yeah.
and create economic uncertainty. But beyond the economics, there are geopolitical implications too. This power struggle in Syria could really strain relations between major players like the U.S. and Russia.
It's like town
Where-
Cato. They're playing a high-stakes poker game, and the stakes just keep getting higher. But wouldn't all-out war be a disaster for everyone? I mean, especially for the energy infrastructure they're fighting over. Is there a limit to how far they'll go?
That's the big question. There's always a risk of escalation, and nobody wants another war. But we've seen it before. Nations prioritize short-term gains over long-term stability.
That's a sobering thought. It makes you wonder, is there any hope for peace and rebuilding in Syria? If everyone's just focused on grabbing resources, it feels like. Reconstruction and stability are taking a backseat to this resource race.
It's a valid concern. We see this a lot in conflict zones. The focus shifts away from peace building and humanitarian aid and towards securing resources and strategic advantage. And that creates a vicious cycle that prolongs the conflict and hinders recovery.
So the rush for resources
Hmm.
is actually making the problem worse.
In a way, yes.
It's like everyone's so focused on winning that they're losing sight of the bigger picture.
Yeah. It's like they're so busy trying to win the battle that they're losing the war.
So what can we do? Is there any way to break this cycle
Hmm.
and prioritize peace and stability over short-term gains? What role can international organizations play, like the UN? Can they mediate this situation and make sure the Syrian people's interests aren't ignored?
Wow. It's tough. The UN often struggles to be effective when you have powerful countries with conflicting interests. But that doesn't mean we should give up on international cooperation and a rules-based order. We have to keep pushing for dialogue and diplomacy.
It's easy to feel powerless when you see these massive geopolitical forces at play. But as you said, we can't just accept the status quo. We have to hold our leaders accountable and demand that they prioritize peace and stability.
Absolutely. We can't forget, behind all the geopolitics, there are real people whose lives are being impacted. It's easy to see this as a far-off problem, but we can't lose sight of the human cost of conflict and the need for peaceful solutions.
That brings us back to our listener. Why should they care about this? About this scramble for Syria's energy? I think you've made some really compelling points. Potential economic consequences, the risk of escalating tensions, and the moral imperative to prioritize peace and the well-being of the Syrian people. It's a complex issue with global implications, and it deserves our attention.
Absolutely. It raises a lot of questions for us all to consider. We can't just assume things will work themselves out. We need to stay informed, engage in thoughtful discussions, and push for solutions that prioritize peace and human dignity.
Wow, this has been really eye-opening, honestly, I have to admit. I came into this thinking it was just about oil and gas, but it's so much bigger than that.
It really is. It's just
Yeah.
this tangled web of economic interests, geopolitics, and real people's lives.
Yeah. To our listener, I hope this has given you a new perspective on the situation in Syria. It's easy to just, read the headlines, but it's important to understand all the deeper forces at play.
Definitely. And it's not just Syria either. This raises questions about how we manage global energy resources, how we deal with international relations, and how we prioritize peace and security.
It is a lot to think about, but one thing's for sure, we can't just be passive observers. We need to stay informed, engage in these tough conversations,
Yeah.
and hold our leaders accountable.
Couldn't agree more. Silence and apathy, they're just not options. We all have a role to play in shaping a more just and peaceful world.
Well said. Expert speaker, thanks so much for joining us and sharing your expertise.
My pleasure.
And to our listener, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and given you some food for thought. What happens next in Syria? Who knows? But the choices made by global powers, they'll have a huge impact on the entire world. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.